By the winter of 1941, the Eastern Front had become the theater of unimaginable brutality. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's grand invasion of the Soviet Union, had initially swept across the Western Soviet territories with terrifying speed. Entire armies were encircled and annihilated. Cities were reduced to rubble, and the Soviet High Command struggled to respond to a foe that seemed unstoppable. The Red Army, still recovering from purges that had decimated its officer corps, was teetering on the brink of collapse. Moscow, the very heart of the Soviet Union, loomed as the final prize for the Wehrmacht, and with each passing day, the Nazi juggernaut inched closer. Stalin, the man whose iron will had guided the USSR through industrialization and political upheaval, was privately plagued with doubt. Publicly, he exuded confidence. Yet in the secret corridors of the Kremlin, the situation appeared far more precarious. Entire divisions were wiped out, supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and morale among Soviet troops was plummeting. The Germans, fueled by their blitzkrieg doctrine, seemed to anticipate every move, encircling Soviet units with ruthless efficiency. The winter approached, but it was a cruel and uncertain ally. The Red Army had little time to regroup, and many feared Moscow might fall before reinforcements could arrive. The human cost was staggering. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, evacuating cities and villages as the Wehrmacht advanced. Starvation, disease, and bombardment became daily realities, and stories of entire towns vanishing under German artillery fire spread like wildfire. On the front lines, commanders struggled to maintain cohesion in the face of relentless attacks, and soldiers were often ordered to hold positions with little hope of survival. The Soviet Union was hemorrhaging men, material, and territory, and the Axis seemed poised to deliver a decisive blow that could crush the Red Army entirely. Yet amid this chaos, the stage was being set for a crucial turn. Stalin understood that conventional responses would no longer suffice. The war demanded bold, unprecedented strategies, and so the Soviet leadership began searching for a lifeline, a plan that could stem the tide of defeat, preserve Moscow, and ultimately reclaim the initiative. Within this dire environment emerged Marshal Zhukov, a man whose military brilliance would soon alter the course of the Eastern Front. Known for his unyielding discipline and audacious tactics, Zhukov was among the few capable of seeing not just the immediate dangers, but the long-term path to victory. As the Wehrmacht approached the gates of Moscow, the Soviet Union teetered on the edge. Every decision made in the Kremlin, every counsel offered by advisors, carried the weight of survival or annihilation. It was in this crucible of desperation and urgency that Stalin would convene with Zhukov, a conversation that, unbeknownst to the world, would chart the course for the Eastern Front and change the trajectory of World War II itself. While the public face of the Soviet Union remained resolute and unwavering, behind the ornate doors of the Kremlin, Joseph Stalin wrestled with fears he could never afford to reveal. The blitzkrieg had shattered expectations, obliterated entire armies, and exposed vulnerabilities that the dictator had long kept hidden from the world. Reports from the front were dire. Encirclements, mass surrenders, and cities under siege painted a grim picture of the Soviet war effort. Yet Stalin's personal anxieties extended beyond mere numbers. He feared not only the fall of Moscow, but also the potential unraveling of the very political machinery he had painstakingly built over decades. Stalin's distrust of his generals had been well documented. Yet the severity of the crisis demanded that he rely on one of the few men whose military insight he could respect. Marshal Zhukov had demonstrated brilliance in earlier conflicts, notably during the defense of Leningrad and in the early counterattacks in western Ukraine. But the stakes now were unprecedented. The German advance had already penetrated deep into Soviet territory, and morale among both soldiers and civilians teetered dangerously. Even the most hardened officers whispered of potential collapse, a fear Stalin had long kept at bay through a combination of terror, propaganda, and sheer force of personality. In private meetings, Stalin voiced concerns that he could never articulate publicly. The speed of the German advance, the devastation inflicted on Soviet infrastructure, and the relentless pressure on supply lines left him sleepless and restless. The threat of betrayal, real or imagined, haunted him. Years of purges had left the Red Army wary and cautious, but also wary of their own leadership. Stalin knew that in this moment, Hesitation could spell catastrophe. The war had shifted from a distant threat to a visceral, existential struggle for survival. Yet amidst these fears, a spark of strategic calculation emerged. Stalin recognized that the Soviet Union's immense geography, harsh winter, and sheer manpower could serve as tools if wielded with cunning and decisiveness. But turning these advantages into victories required not just courage, but the rare combination of tactical brilliance and unwavering loyalty. Zhukov embodied both qualities. Unlike many in Stalin's circle, Zhukov would speak truth to power, offering blunt assessments of the front lines and proposing strategies that were audacious, risky, yet potentially decisive. As he prepared to meet with Zhukov, Stalin meticulously reviewed intelligence reports, casualty figures, and maps detailing troop movements. He considered not only the immediate tactical threats, but also the broader implications of every decision. Every lost village, every destroyed railway, and every delay in reinforcements weighed heavily on his mind. Stalin's secret worries were not merely about territory. They were about the survival of the Soviet state, the future of the Communist Party, and the preservation of his own grip on power. In this high-stakes environment, the conversation that would soon take place between Stalin and Zhukov was no ordinary military briefing. It was a crucible of strategy, trust, and foresight. Decisions made in that room would determine whether the Soviet Union would crumble under German pressure or rise with unmatched resilience. Stalin's fears, combined with Zhukov's clarity and decisiveness, were about to forge the plans that would define the Eastern Front, and perhaps the outcome of World War II itself. It was December 1941, and the chill of the Russian winter had begun to creep through the marble halls of the Kremlin. Outside, Moscow's streets were lined with soldiers returning from harrowing battles, their faces etched with fatigue and fear. Inside, Stalin prepared for a meeting that would define the fate of the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. Marshal Zhukov, the general whose reputation for tactical brilliance had grown with each encounter with the Wehrmacht, had been summoned. The air was thick with tension, a palpable mix of urgency, apprehension, and the weight of the nation's survival. The meeting began in the small, dimly lit office Stalin reserved for his most confidential discussions. Maps of the front lines were spread across the table, marked with troop positions, supply lines, and German advances. Reports of encircled Soviet units, cities under siege, and mounting casualties littered to the table. Stalin, ever meticulous, scrutinized every detail, aware that one miscalculation could mean the end of Moscow and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Zhukov entered the room with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen the front lines firsthand. His presence alone commanded attention. Stalin, despite his usual dominance, knew he was dealing with a strategist whose insight was unmatched. The general wasted no time, presenting an unflinching analysis of the German advance. He described not only the movements of tanks and infantry, but also the psychological toll on the soldiers and civilians. Every report was blunt, unsparing, and precise, a stark contrast to the politically filtered intelligence Stalin often received. As the discussion deepened, Zhukov proposed bold countermeasures. He outlined the potential for concentrated counterattacks, strategic withdrawals, and the utilization of reserves stationed east of Moscow. His plan emphasized mobility, surprise, and the exploitation of Germany's overextended supply lines. Zhukov's voice carried the weight of experience, yet each recommendation also contained calculated risk, decisions that required absolute trust between Stalin and his generals. For Stalin, the meeting was a test of both strategy and loyalty. He had long feared disloyalty within his ranks, a legacy of the purges that had decimated the Red Army's officer corps. Yet Zhukov's clarity and candor were undeniable. In that room, the dictator allowed himself to set aside paranoia, focusing instead on the tactical possibilities that could turn the tide of war. Every word, every gesture, and every counterpoint mattered. Stalin knew that history would judge not just the outcome of the war, but the wisdom of the choices made in this very office. The hours passed in intense deliberation, each moment weighted with the lives of millions. Stalin's questions were sharp, probing weaknesses, assessing logistics, and testing the feasibility of Zhukov's proposals. Zhukov responded with precision, offering alternatives, contingency plans, and a vision for how the Soviet Union could regain the initiative. By the end of the meeting, a plan began to crystallize, a strategy that relied on calculated risk, the resilience of the Russian people, and the unyielding determination of the Red Army. As Zhukov departed, Stalin remained, contemplating the conversation and its implications. The Eastern Front was far from secure, but for the first time in months, he sensed a glimmer of hope. The conversation had not only shaped immediate military strategy, but it also forged a partnership that would define the Soviet response to Hitler's advance. In the shadows of the Kremlin, amidst the cold and the fear, the seeds of a turning point on the Eastern Front were planted. Days after the fateful meeting in the Kremlin, Zhukov returned to his headquarters, with a plan that would redefine the Soviet approach to the German onslaught. Moscow was still shivering under the bitter winter, its citizens huddled in homes and factories, while the relentless Wehrmacht pressed ever closer. The Eastern Front was in chaos, yet Zhukov's mind was a landscape of strategy, calculation, and audacity. He understood that to survive, the Soviets could not merely defend, they had to strike decisively. Zhukov's proposal was audacious, a massive counteroffensive, designed not only to halt the German advance but to encircle and annihilate entire army groups. His plan relied on rapid redeployment of reserves, precise coordination of artillery and armor, and the strategic use of Moscow's harsh winter as an ally. He recognized that the Germans, confident in their early victories, had overextended their supply lines and underestimated the resilience of the Soviet soldiers. Zhukov intended to exploit every weakness, every logistical oversight, and every overconfidence within the enemy ranks. The proposal was meticulously detailed. Troop movements were mapped with precision. Supply caches and rail lines were pinpointed. Reserves positioned to strike at critical junctures were highlighted. Zhukov's strategy was unconventional. He proposed simultaneous attacks on multiple fronts to disorient the Germans, combined with feigned retreats to draw enemy forces into kill zones. Every maneuver was designed to maximize the impact of Soviet strength while minimizing casualties, though he knew heavy losses were inevitable. Stalin's reaction to the proposal was cautious but intrigued. The dictator had seen many plans fail, often because of overconfidence or the unreliability of officers in the field. Yet Zhukov's reputation, forged in countless battles and tempered by a pragmatic understanding of both human and mechanical limitations, lent credibility to the plan. Stalin recognized that if the proposal succeeded, it could shift the balance of the war, saving Moscow and potentially turning the tide on the Eastern Front. The discussions that followed were intense. Stalin questioned every detail, probing for flaws, testing assumptions, and demanding contingencies. Zhukov responded with clarity and confidence, defending his choices with evidence drawn from intelligence reports, battlefield experience, and a keen understanding of German tactics. The interplay between dictator and general was tense yet productive, a rare moment where strategic brilliance could confront political caution without succumbing to fear. Ultimately, Stalin approved a modified version of Zhukov's plan, one that retained its boldness while incorporating the dictator's insistence on caution and redundancy. Orders were dispatched, troops readied, and supply lines adjusted. Zhukov's vision was now set in motion, a delicate balance between daring and discipline. The Soviet leadership understood that failure could mean the fall of Moscow, yet success promised a defining moment in the war, an opportunity to reclaim the initiative and restore hope to a nation battered by months of retreat and despair. As preparations continued, Zhukov remained vigilant, aware that timing, coordination, and the unyielding spirit of his soldiers would determine the outcome. His proposal was more than a military plan. It was a statement of intent. A declaration that the Soviet Union would not merely endure but fight back with precision, strategy, and determination. In the frozen expanses of the Eastern Front, the stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of human endurance and tactical genius. As the harsh winter gripped the Eastern Front, Zhukov's preparations reached their final stages. Snow blanketed the forests, fields, and frozen rivers, transforming the battleground into a landscape as treacherous as it was strategic. Soviet soldiers, haggard but determined, waited in the shadows of frost-laden villages, their breaths visible in the frigid air. Supplies had been stockpiled, artillery positioned, and tanks hidden among snowdrifts. Every detail Zhukov had meticulously planned, now depended on the discipline and resilience of his troops. On a bitterly cold morning in December, the first signals were sent. Orders crackled over field telephones, and messengers raced through snowbound roads. The Soviet counteroffensive, long in planning, had finally begun. German forces, confident after months of relentless advance, were caught off guard. Their lines, stretched thin by overextended supply routes and exhausted soldiers, were vulnerable to coordinated strikes. Zhukov's strategy relied on the element of surprise, and in the icy dawn, Soviet divisions surged forward with precision. The initial attacks were relentless. Artillery roared across the frozen plains, shelling enemy fortifications with devastating accuracy. Soviet tanks, camouflaged against the snow, rolled forward to support infantry assaults. Feints and diversions drew German units away from key positions, while mobile strike groups encircled pockets of resistance. Zhukov's coordination was flawless, a testament to months of meticulous preparation. Each Soviet soldier understood their role, from the rifleman in the village street to the officer directing artillery fire from a nearby ridge. The Germans, initially stunned, quickly attempted to regroup. Commanders struggled to issue coherent orders as communication lines faltered under the onslaught. Panic began to spread among the ranks, and isolated units were cut off, trapped in the cold and under heavy fire. Zhukov's plan, relying on both precision and the psychological pressure of encirclement, began to show its devastating effectiveness. Entire German divisions were forced to retreat or surrender, their confidence shattered by the ferocity and coordination of the Soviet assault. Meanwhile, Zhukov monitored the battle from his command post, making real-time adjustments as intelligence reports flowed in. Reserves were redirected to exploit breakthroughs. Supply lines rerouted to sustain momentum, and artillery concentrations shifted to critical sectors. His presence, calm yet commanding, inspired officers and soldiers alike. Every decision reinforced the message that the Soviet Union would fight with discipline, strategy, and an unyielding resolve to reclaim its territory. By the end of the first week, the scale of the counteroffensive became evident. German forces had suffered significant losses, and strategic towns previously considered lost were gradually being reclaimed. Zhukov's gamble on winter warfare had paid off, using the freezing conditions as an ally rather than an obstacle. The morale of the Soviet troops soared, while the Wehrmacht began to realize that they were facing a formidable, coordinated opponent, not the disorganized resistance they had expected. The winter counteroffensive was not merely a military operation. It was a statement. Zhukov had demonstrated that careful planning, audacity, and the relentless spirit of his soldiers could challenge even the most confident of foes. Across the Eastern Front, the battle lines shifted, signaling the beginning of a campaign that would eventually change the course of World War II. The frozen landscape was now a theater of strategy, heroism, and endurance, with the eyes of the world focused on the Soviet response to the Nazi advance. December 1941. In Berlin, the war room was cloaked in an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of papers and the tick of the ornate clock on the wall. Adolf Hitler, usually brimming with confidence and ruthless conviction, paced the room like a caged predator. Reports from the Eastern Front had begun arriving, detailing Soviet movements that were both audacious and devastating. They were marked, long accustomed to success against seemingly weaker foes, now faced a disciplined and strategic opponent. Hitler's shock was palpable. The initial reports were alarming. Entire divisions, once thought invincible, had been encircled and destroyed by Soviet forces under the command of Marshal Zhukov. Hetman units spread thin and reliant on overextended supply lines were struggling to respond to the speed and coordination of the Soviet winter communication failures, exacerbated by the harsh winter conditions, left commanders isolated, forced to improvise in a rapidly deteriorating situation. Hitler's confidence in his generals wavered, replaced by growing paranoia and disbelief. In the bunker, Hitler demanded explanations. Maps were spread across tables, dotted with red marks indicating Soviet advances. High-ranking officers, including Field Marshal von Bock and General von Lieb, attempted to convey the severity of the situation. Their words met with skepticism and occasional rage. Hitler, unable to accept the scale of the Soviet resurgence, dismissed many suggestions, clinging to outdated intelligence and overly optimistic reports. The chasm between reality and his expectations widened with each incoming dispatch. Meanwhile, the strategic brilliance of Zhukov's plan became increasingly clear. Soviet forces were not merely reacting. They were dictating the tempo of the conflict. By leveraging the harsh winter, exploiting weak points in German supply lines, and employing encirclement tactics, Zhukov had achieved what many had considered impossible. For Hitler, who had previously underestimated the resilience and ingenuity of the Red Army, this was a bitter revelation. The image of an unstoppable Wehrmacht, clashing with a crumbling Soviet defense, had been shattered. The psychological impact on Hitler cannot be overstated. His shock quickly transformed into anger, manifesting as impulsive decisions and unrealistic demands for counterattack. German officers faced a volatile mix of orders, sometimes contradictory, often impossible to execute under the freezing conditions of the Eastern Front. Morale among troops suffered as the leadership vacuum grew, and the once confident German war machine began to show signs of strain and hesitation. Hitler's misjudgment of the Soviet capacity to recover, rebuild, and strike back would have profound consequences. Zhukov's careful planning and the resilience of the Soviet troops demonstrated that the Eastern Front was no longer a straightforward path to victory. Each lost village, each encircled division, was a blow not only to German military capability, but to Hitler's vision of an unstoppable advance toward Moscow. As winter deepened, Hitler's shock hardened into a grudging respect for his enemy. Though he would never openly acknowledge it, the Wehrmacht's failures on the Eastern Front were not due to luck or poor leadership alone. They were the result of a strategic mastermind who had anticipated and outmaneuvered them. Across Germany, in the quiet tension of the war room, a new reality was dawning. The Soviet Union would not collapse, as he had once imagined, and the Eastern Front would be a long, brutal test of endurance, strategy, and resolve. Winter, 1941. While Hitler's anger and disbelief raged in Berlin, Moscow remained a bastion of unshakable determination. Joseph Stalin, the austere and enigmatic leader of the Soviet Union, had long learned the power of patience in war. Unlike his German counterpart, Stalin understood that the battle for the Eastern Front would not be decided by rash maneuvers or impulsive offensives. Every move, every allocation of resources, was meticulously calculated, and the harsh Russian winter would soon reveal the wisdom of his restraint. Reports from Zhukov, Nastavka. The Soviet High Command detailed the state of the front lines. Retreating Soviet forces were not defeated. They were strategically Factories had been relocated east of the Ural Mountains, and the Red Army was regrouping, replenishing, and preparing for a counteroffensive that would test the limits of the Wehrmacht. Stalin's patience was not passivity. It was a strategy in itself. By conserving strength, forcing the Germans deeper into hostile territory, and allowing them to exhaust their supply lines, he laid the groundwork for a devastating response. Stalin convened with his generals in the dimly lit Kremlin war rooms, where maps of the front lines were spread across long tables. Zhukov, a man renowned for both intellect and ruthlessness, advised carefully on troop movements and potential counterattacks. Stalin listened with characteristic silence, interjecting only when necessary, weighing every scenario, every risk, and every advantage. The contrast with Hitler's reactive, emotion-driven strategy could not have been starker. Where the Germans were consumed by panic and frustration, the Soviets acted with deliberate precision. The Soviet population, too, felt the weight of Stalin's strategy. Civilians endured harsh winters, food shortages, and the constant threat of German advance. Yet they labored to support the war effort. The relocation of industry, the construction of defensive fortifications, and the mobilization of reserves demonstrated that patience and endurance were as vital as guns and tanks. Stalin understood that the war was not just fought in the battlefield. It was fought in factories, farms, and hearts of ordinary citizens. By December 1941, as German troops faltered in their winter campaign, Stalin's calculated patience began to bear fruit. The Red Army was prepared to launch its winter counteroffensive, a decisive series of strikes designed to encircle and push back the overextended Wehrmacht. Zhukov's meticulous planning ensured that Soviet forces would strike with precision, exploiting German weaknesses while minimizing unnecessary losses. Stalin's restraint had transformed what appeared to be a perilous situation into a carefully orchestrated opportunity. Hitler, in contrast, remained blinded by his expectations. Each report of Soviet resilience, each failure of the German advance, heightened his frustration. He could not grasp that Stalin's silence, Stalin's inaction in certain moments, was not weakness. It was strategy. The Eastern Front was shifting, not because of chance, but because of deliberate calculation and the unyielding resolve of a nation under extraordinary pressure. Stalin's patience exemplified a critical lesson of war. Victory is not always seized in moments of brilliance, but often earned through timing and the meticulous orchestration of resources. As winter deepened, the Red Army readied itself to strike, and Hitler's hubris faced the harshest test of his career. The stage was set for a confrontation that would alter the course of history, and Stalin, patient and calculating, stood ready to reshape the fate of Europe. As winter tightened its icy grip on the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht, overconfident and exhausted, approached the outskirts of Moscow. Hitler had expected the Soviet capital to fall by the onset of December 1941. Yet, unbeknownst to him, Georgy Zhukov had orchestrated one of the most daring defensive operations in military history. The Battle of Moscow was not just a clash of armies. It was the culmination of strategy, patience, and resilience that would forever alter the trajectory of World War II. Recently recalled from the Leningrad front, immediately assessed the situation. The German advance, though rapid and initially successful, was dangerously overextended. Supply lines were fractured. Troops were fatigued, and the brutal Russian winter had begun to sap morale and effectiveness. Zhukov knew that a counteroffensive required precision, coordination, and timing. Any misstep could result in catastrophe. He meticulously analyzed the terrain, the disposition of German forces, and the strengths of his own troops, devising a plan that combined defensive endurance with explosive, targeted strikes. Behind the scenes, the Stavka worked tirelessly. Soviet reinforcements poured into Moscow, often transported under cover of night to avoid German reconnaissance. Armies previously scattered across the Western fronts were reorganized, retrained, and equipped for winter warfare. Zhukov personally supervised the fortification of key defensive positions, turning the approaches to Moscow into a deadly maze of trenches, bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles. Every hill, every forest, every frozen river became a potential advantage against the invading Germans. When the German offensive stalled, weakened by frostbite, logistical failures, and relentless Soviet resistance, Zhukov struck. The counteroffensive launched in early December was both swift and devastating. Soviet troops encircled exhausted German divisions, striking at their flanks and rear with unexpected ferocity. The meticulously planned operation exploited every weakness, turning the invaders' confidence into chaos. Hitler's expectations of a quick, decisive victory evaporated in the bitter cold, replaced by the harsh reality of strategic overreach. The human cost was immense on both sides, yet the operation revealed the ingenuity and courage of the Red Army. Soldiers fought not only with rifles and artillery, but with determination fueled by the understanding that the fate of their capital, and perhaps their nation, hung in the balance. Zhukov's leadership inspired confidence and instilled discipline, ensuring that Soviet forces acted with cohesion and resolve, even in the most dire conditions. By the end of December, German forces were in retreat, a humiliating reversal that shattered the myth of their invincibility. Zhukov's masterstroke at Moscow had achieved more than a military victory. It marked a psychological turning point in the Eastern Front. Hitler's arrogance had met its match in Zhukov's strategic brilliance, and the momentum of the war began to shift. The resilience of the Soviet Union, combined with careful planning and decisive action, had staved off disaster and signaled that the Germans would not achieve the swift conquest they had envisioned. Zhukov's Moscow campaign became a blueprint for defensive warfare under extreme conditions, a testament to the power of foresight, leadership, and meticulous preparation. For Stalin and the Soviet High Command, it was proof that patience, calculation, and strategic audacity could overcome even the most formidable of enemies. The Eastern Front was changing, and with Zhukov at the helm, the Soviets were ready to seize the initiative. After the shocking resilience displayed at Moscow, The Soviet High Command understood that the tide could be turned, but the victory would require meticulous planning and daring execution. Stalin, recognizing both the danger and the opportunity, summoned Zhukov to a clandestine session in the Kremlin. The stakes could not have been higher. Hitler's forces, though battered by winter and overextension, still had immense combat power. Any miscalculation could spell disaster for Moscow and potentially for the entire Soviet Union. Zhukov entered the meeting with the clarity and decisiveness that had already earned him legendary status among his peers. Maps of the front lines covered the walls, marked with German positions, Soviet troop concentrations, and key logistical hubs. Stalin, typically inscrutable, pressed for precise assessments. The strength of enemy divisions, their supply situations, the morale of their troops. Zhukov, calm yet urgent, laid out a plan that balanced offense with caution, designed to exploit the Germans' overreach while minimizing Soviet casualties. The conversation was a strategic symphony. Stalin questioned, probed, and occasionally challenged Zhukov's recommendations, but the general's mastery of operational detail was undeniable. He described a counteroffensive that would strike simultaneously on multiple fronts, using the harsh winter and Soviet mobility to disorient and encircled the invaders. Each strike would be timed to perfection, combining artillery barrages, infantry maneuvers, and tank support in coordinated waves. The goal was not merely to push the Germans back, but to break their will to fight. Behind closed doors, the two men discussed logistics with painstaking detail. Rail lines would transport fresh divisions to key sectors. Supply depots would be concealed and fortified, and reserves would be held in strategic depth to respond to any German feints. Stalin, aware of the immense human cost, pressed Zhukov on minimizing unnecessary losses. But he also recognized that audacity and timing could turn the war in the Soviets' favor. The counteroffensive, Tebot-Sanu, had to be swift, decisive, and psychologically shattering for the Wehrmacht. Zhukov's plan incorporated lessons from previous failures and successes, the importance of surprise, the utility of winter warfare, and the psychological impact of relentless, coordinated pressure. He emphasized mobility and deception, using decoys and feints to lure German forces into traps. Every division, every regiment, and even every platoon had a role, and the synchronization of these units could determine the outcome of the Eastern Front. The meeting concluded with Stalin giving Zhukov full authority to execute the counteroffensive. It was a rare moment of trust between the political leader and the military commander. Stalin knew that the coming weeks would define the future of the Soviet Union and potentially alter the course of World War II. Zhukov left the Kremlin with a clear mandate, understanding that success required precision, boldness, and the unyielding will to overcome the enemy. In the quiet that followed, Moscow's streets still bore the scars of battle. Yet behind the scenes, a plan was taking shape that would strike at the heart of Hitler's ambitions. The conversation between Stalin and Zhukov was more than a meeting. It was the birth of a counteroffensive that would not only save the Soviet capital but also signaled the beginning of the German retreat on the Eastern Front. History would remember it as a moment when strategic genius and political resolve converged, setting the stage for a turning point that the world had yet to witness. As winter gripped the Eastern Front, the German army found itself overextended, its supply lines stretched across frozen landscapes, and morale dwindling under the relentless pressure of Soviet resistance. Hitler, confident in his generals and the invincibility of the Wehrmacht, had underestimated both the resilience of the Soviet forces and the strategic genius of Georgy Zhukov. Meanwhile, Stalin, having placed his trust in Zhukov's meticulous planning, waited for the precise moment to strike, aware that timing was everything. In the dead of January 1942, Zhukov launched the counteroffensive around Moscow. The operation was swift, coordinated, and devastating. Soviet forces concealed by deep snow and expertly timed maneuvers struck the German flanks with ferocity. Encirclement tactics, honed in the months of preparation and refined in the Kremlin meeting with Stalin, allowed Soviet divisions to trap entire German units. The Wehrmacht, accustomed to rapid victories and underestimating the Soviet capacity for found themselves caught in a deadly web of artillery, infantry, and armored assaults. The counteroffensive's psychological impact was immediate. German troops, exhausted and demoralized, began to retreat chaotically. Communications faltered as Soviet forces severed supply lines, and Hitler's rigid command structure failed to respond effectively. Zhukov's strategy capitalized on every weakness. Harsh weather, overconfidence, and logistical failures combined to turn the tide decisively in favor of the Soviets. Cities and towns that had been on the brink of occupation witnessed a dramatic reversal, with Soviet banners rising once more over liberated streets. Behind the scenes, Stalin observed the unfolding events with cautious optimism. The counteroffensive was not merely a military maneuver. It was a statement of Soviet resolve. The combination of meticulous planning, strategic deception, and sheer human endurance shattered the myth of the invincible German army. Zhukov, executing the operation with precision, demonstrated the full weight of Soviet military doctrine, blending tactical brilliance with ruthless efficiency. As weeks passed, the Wehrmacht suffered catastrophic losses. Entire divisions were annihilated, armored units immobilized, and elite troops decimated. Hitler's ambitious drive for Moscow was halted, and the psychological shock reverberated across German command. The Soviet counteroffensive not only protected the capital but signaled the beginning of a sustained pushback that would eventually carry deep into occupied territories. This moment marked a turning point on the Eastern Front. The collaboration between Stalin and Zhukov, rooted in strategic insight, audacity, and disciplined execution, had fundamentally altered the trajectory of World War II. The German army's aura of invincibility was broken, and the Soviet Union's resilience became the defining narrative of the conflict. In the frozen expanses around Moscow, the echoes of battle and the footprints of the counteroffensive would be remembered as a testament to human endurance, strategic brilliance, and the unwavering determination to defend one's homeland. The Eastern Front, once teetering on the brink of collapse, now stood as a beacon of resistance and a prelude to the eventual liberation of Soviet territories. History would record the Soviet counteroffensive not just as a military victory, but as the pivotal moment when the fate of nations hung in the balance, and the tide of war began its inexorable turn.